All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us this Thursday morning. Even more impressive when people join us on a Thursday morning. I know everybody's got work and other commitments, so appreciate you taking the time to join us. Let me go ahead and make sure we've got the recording started. And we're good to go. All right, so just a quick heads up, this is going to be recorded. When it's done, it's going to be sent to everybody that's registered as well as posted on YouTube. So that way, you can always go back and watch the recording later on. But this morning we have the pleasure of Joe Odell joining us. I'll let Joe kind of do a little bit of an introduction for himself, but just to get started, Joe is a Navy veteran. He is a graduate of the UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. He conducted a traditional search with a partner where they raised a search fund and then acquired a business that was doing quite well until it wasn't. And I'll let Joe kind of walk through his story and kind of talk to his search process. But the main things we want to touch on are going to be what it's like once you're in the seat, once you're an operator, especially when you feel like you've made a good acquisition and then things just don't go your way. And Joe is going to be able to talk to us a little bit about that. And bear with us. This is very fresh. I think, remind me if I'm wrong, but August, I think, is when your business went under, right?
Yeah. Yep.
All right.
Good.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joe. I'm going to let him tell his story. And then towards the end, if we've got time, we'll open up for some Q&A. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, first thing, there's one thing I have to correct with your introduction, which is I'm a Coast Guardsman. So as a vet yourself, I know that that might have been on purpose. I know, Jed, you might have been just messing with me, so all good.
I didn't want to disparage you by saying you remember the Coast Guard.
Okay. Yeah, I am taller than 6 foot. There's some jokes there. But anyways, yeah, so I got out in 2013 from the Coast Guard and was doing search and rescue law enforcement. I was enlisted too, so seems slightly rare. It feels like in the search space to be the enlisted side. Started getting consulting back then. Worked for free to get my foot in the door in a consulting firm, and did that for about 3 months. And they started paying me $10 an hour. I had a wife and 2 kids, just grinding, working on my undergrad at night. And within a handful of years, I had my undergrad. I was running a team of about 60 at that firm, signing contracts with Google and Red Hat, a bunch of other big tech firms in the Bay Area in California. So I did that, realized I still had some GI Bill left and wanted to get my master's. And I've always been a great test taker, like ASVAB-wise, crushed it. And then GMAT just kind of took it on a 2-week whim, cram session, and crushed that too. So it's kind of like, hey, I'll just take it to see what I need to study on, and then got a really good score. I'm like, oh, I might be going to business school soon. So ended up applying to UC Berkeley, got in, and Haas School of Business, and ended up graduating 2019, 2020 is when I graduated. While in school, learned about search, and I'd been in the VC world with all my consulting in the past. And the one thing as a sales go-to-market strategist minded person, the problem with the VC is product market fit. Doesn't matter how good of a salesperson you are, doesn't matter how good your funnel is. If your market and product don't fit, you must have quit. I think that's it. I don't know. So I went through that process, and when I learned about search, I'm like, so I can actually step into a business that should have that already figured out, right? They have revenue, they're profitable, and I can just work on scaling it. Yeah, that sounds cool. So went through the process of trying to raise or build my PPM and start to raise. Took on a partner because my background from the finance side is lacking. So I took a CFO, a classmate of mine, and we both started raising capital. Took us about 4 or 5 months to actually raise from start to finish. There were a few dry months where we didn't think we were going to make it, and eventually got there. Just kind of kept working on top of the funnel, adding more people to the list. One of the questions that generally come up in the story is, why not self-funded? I am married. My wife is extremely risk averse. So the idea of taking a personal guarantee is off the table. So if I wanted to do this, I had to do it traditional. Or if I wanted to stay married, of course, which was a priority for me. So 2021 March is when we ended up raising the capital for the initial fund. Within 2 months, I had found the business we'd eventually acquire. Had about 8 interns, ran a machine, had everything running, really heavy on throughput when it came to top of funnel for lead generation and for these new deals and sourcing. And we closed a deal within 6 months of finding it. So a total of about 8-9 months of total search. The business itself, and I'll stop there, was about 3.5 to 4 million in EBITDA. Add backs that, whether they were real or not, are tough. It was a healthcare business focused on home health services, so really the IV portion of home health patients. And the add backs that made it really tough is there was the 2020 healthcare bump for home health, and so really trying to tease out what was the real EBITDA of the business versus what was the inflated EBITDA of the business from 2020 was really difficult. And years later you can kind of piece it together, but in the moment it's tough. And then on top of that, we strapped about 4x debt ratio on it, so about $12 million in total bank debt, and a seller note on top of that. So yeah, it was about 6 times EBITDA is what our purchase price was. Yeah, so that's kind of the quick intro to. Up to that point, I thought like all my dreams had come true, and through a lot of pain, sweat, and tears. Yeah. So that was December 21.
Wow, so that the first big takeaway, other than the fact you went the traditional route, 2 things. One, you decided to go the traditional route mainly because of the personal guarantee, and I think this is something that is either discussed way too much or not enough at all. And what I mean by that is, especially in the search world, you have people like yourself are thinking about, is it worth it from a risk perspective to take on the personal guarantee? And a lot of times that's a personal decision, that's a family decision. Really interesting to hear how you had that discussion with your wife. But on the flip side, I think a lot of people, especially those who are not in the ETA community, they don't even think about the personal guarantee. They're like, cool, no problem, sign away. So what was the real concern that, like, especially like from your spouse's perspective, that if this all goes negative, what's the worst case scenario? And that would be like losing your home, losing everything you have.
Yeah, and we don't have a ton of wealth. It's why search is exciting to people, right? It's not generally because you have millions of dollars in the bank that you decide to go do search, right? Like if you do, there's probably other ways to make money that are less stressful. So for me and my wife, we are opposites, complete opposites, and we've been married for 14 years. Learned early on that I'm 37, so I got married in like early to mid 20s, like 23, I guess. So we learned really early in marriage that we're complete opposites, and somewhere in the middle is probably the right choice. So there's a lot of negotiation that we've had in our marriage. They got 3 kids now. So it really came down to, okay, like I can do this. She's never going to hold me back, but we're going to mitigate as much risk as possible. And I'm very optimistic. She's pessimistic. So our middle ground is, okay, how do we achieve this without risking everything? We did have a house in California at the time, and now we have one in Texas, but yeah.
Oh, I think that's a really sober way to look at it. And this is something I tell everybody, the risk analysis is very personal. Some people, they're much like you. I'm kind of opposite from my wife. So, if it was up to me, everything would be on the table all the time. And then if it was up to her, it'd be the exact opposite. So finding that middle ground is really important. But the second thing I noticed is that your search was actually really fast. I think the Stanford study, especially for traditional search, tells us 18 to 24 months is the norm. And that's if you close. And we know like 40% of those search funds never actually acquire. So the business you found, was it just, looking back, do you think it was just pure luck? I mean, did you have a buy box that you were kind of looking at and it just kind of checked all the boxes? Or how do you think that came about?
Yeah, we were really systematic with a few different things. One, my background is go-to-market strategy for about a decade. So search from a sourcing perspective is all a funnel, right? Now, getting into due diligence on the LOI stage, I had very little experience with. That's where I had my CFO partner that came into work and crushed that section of it. And we'll talk about the issues you ran into and what misses occurred in due diligence and if they were even catchable, right? And like that's a whole different discussion. I still haven't made up my mind yet if we were able to really figure that piece out. But from the search perspective and finding businesses, we had a machine running that was highly effective. One of the coolest businesses, so I really searched for 2 months before we kind of locked in an LOI. One of the coolest businesses I found was a proprietary deal that was, from a divorce, which is sad, but They were selling, a really cool a business in Hawaii, which my wife is actually from Hawaii, and had a bunch of stuff. So we had some really cool deals we were looking at really early on. Part of that was before I even started searching, I'd built out our website, I'd built out our process. I had an onboarding doc for all of our interns. We started 8 interns and cycled them every 10 weeks. Had an MBA intern that wanted to search at some point that's running the teams. I really just built like a SDR to AE model. I was the account executive. They're just putting stuff in my calendar. So 5 to 6 bookings a day on my calendar. I was talking to somebody, either a broker or an actual business owner that was willing to give me advice. One of the biggest things I can say is if you're trying to book time with a seller, asking to buy their business over email is probably not going to be effective because you want to, everyone puts that out there. So I took the approach of advice and saying, hey, I'm really interested in your industry. It's something that we might look at investing in the near future, but really would hope that I could get like 10 minutes to ask you a few questions so I can learn more about what you guys do. Really focusing on the advice aspect rather than, can I pay you a couple $1 million and, get married to you for a long time?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent quick breakdown of search. And one of the questions I get a lot is, how do I find a business? And the first thing I tell people is like, just get off BizBuySell, but usually it's proprietary search and broker outreach. And for all of us, I remember when I was first searching, figuring out how proprietary search is done is an art of its own. And it's really interesting, like how right from the beginning, you took that proprietary approach very seriously, had an intern, had a process, had systems in place. And in a lot of ways, it speaks to how, as a searcher, you are, building a startup, essentially, a lead generation startup.
Yeah, no, completely. And it's a sales process, right? Getting investors is a sales process, whether you have to do that, pre like I did and post for someone like you on, the self-funded side, like you're still gonna have to sell yourself in the deal, right? And so then when you actually acquire a business, you got to sell yourself to the employees and to the partners and to this is an entire, sales just permeates through search 100%. So, having a background in it, even before going into it, is wildly helpful. On top of that, if you don't yet, you haven't got to this point in your life probably without being a good salesperson. You just haven't codified it yet. You don't know what it is and how and why you're good at it, and that's something you should spend some time discovering. And I'm happy to help people with that too, because I do a lot of that coaching actually. Like, hey, introverts are actually the best salespeople, for instance, and why you might ask that? Because they are active listeners. They will actually think before they speak. And so if you think because you're an introvert, you're not a good salesperson, you're actually probably the best. That is my tip of the day.
Solid tip. All right. So moving forward, you had your search, you identified the business, and like you said, you went into due diligence. And this is something I can tell, like you've already said this, I would say this for myself. And for the 8 or 9 business owners I've met in the last 3 or 4 weeks whose businesses have gone under, we all look back and we think, oh my goodness, what did I miss in due diligence? And there are definitely things that you miss, but most of the time, and it's not all the time, but most of the time, you look back and you realize that those are things that you never could have caught, or like you probably would not have found. And so looking back on due diligence, obviously there, hindsight is 2020 and you can see things that you missed, but is there anything in the moment in due diligence where you're like, man, I could have done this, but I didn't. And I think that would have been an extra step that would have made sense.
Yeah, I think there's some really good verbiage you can use and to really describe this problem. For me, it's like I could have caught it, but should I have caught it? Those are the two things, right? Like when someone's doing due diligence, should they catch this? And chances are probably yes, I could have, but should I have? I don't know. Like I wish I would have for sure, but there are multiple layers. Like you have to go, you got an 8 or 7 layer dip, bean dip, and you got to go all the way down to the bottom. The problem with due diligence is like you're usually looking like the 3 or 4 layers deep, right? Until you smell a problem, then you got to keep going. And if there's no like sign of problems in the first couple layers, you stop digging, right? Because you're just wasting everybody's time most of the time. And if you drag on your complete sales stage. So for me, one of the issues we ran into right away when I came into the business is we were under the impression the business has been growing year over year by 20%, both in top line and in EBITDA. Obviously, that's exciting. And when we started the due diligence phase, it was a 6-month period till we actually closed. During that 6-month period, two key things happened. One, we had a sales rep leave, and we weren't able to catch that. Wasn't clearly disclosed, and they took about $2 million of the business with them. So that was hefty, about 10% of the business. The other thing that happened was we had a misunderstanding of growth of the company. So for whatever reason, there was a process that was put in place that appeared to make the company look like it was growing in census, which is the amount of patients that it has on record, by 20 to 30% year over year. There, we're talking about that 7-layer dip. In the 7th layer, when you look at that, there was actually 40% of that total was duplicates. So in actual, it was decreasing by 10% year over year. And that was a huge miss. However, from hindsight, I still don't know how I was going to catch that. There was no numerical identifier to cross cancel, and I did a lot of that work to try and be like, hey, is there duplicates here? There wasn't any obvious way to erase duplicates, whether through patient numbers or through even social security numbers. You'd have to assume every name that was the same on potentially thousands of patients was a duplicate, which you can't do that when you have Tom Smith and you have several of those, and which ones are duplicates, I don't know. Did they just move? They have a different address. So there's stuff like that where you'd have to really, really know and be looking for. So bottom line is, we walked into a business we thought that was continuing to grow at 20, maybe 30% this year over year, to a business that was decreasing by 10%, and costs for the business, whether they're COGS, labor, or whatever, had been trending with that 30%, which made sense to us until we walked in and realized it's actually decreasing and our costs are increasing. So we walked into a business that was almost break even from day one, that was having a hard time collecting cash. So we're looking at a hefty $12 million payment for our debt, and like $200K a month, and no cash within a couple of months. So immediately in the grinder.
So you thought it was growing by 30%, and on day one, well, within the first month or so, you realize that not only you're not growing by 30%, you're actually declining by 10%. Your costs are going up in reverse of that. And at the same time, one of your top salesmen has left and taken 10% of the business with you. So you find yourself stepping into a fire pretty quickly.
Correct.
And you made a point there about how you're having trouble collecting cash. And now you've got this, you got all this leverage that you have to cover. And so I want to touch on this because regardless of the business, whether it's doing well or not doing well, or what the situation is, managing the cash conversion cycle is always the number one problem, always, and getting your hands on that. So I'd love to hear you talk about, like, obviously you're stepping into this fire, but let's talk about the cash conversion cycle you're in and the issues you're running into and what you did to try to mitigate and, plug the holes.
Yeah, and I don't think we've talked about that before, so it's a good question. That my CFO is awesome. She was actually the CEO for us. I was a co-CEO and COO, but little kiddo, nice. But yeah, I got to hand it to her. She did amazing. The business when we walked in was paying bills as they came in the door. They'd immediately write a check and send it out. That was their process and system. So for us, when it came to AP, we just pulled back, pushed everyone, hey, we have a net 30 rule. So we immediately get 30 days back of cash once we realized what was wrong. It was something we were going to work on, but as soon as we realized, hey, cash is drying up, we literally went from close to $1 million in the bank to less than 100K, like within a month or two. It was wild, extremely wild. And so we're pulling back cash as much as we can. Someone that manages cash in the business said, this is normal in January, February. This is, always goes like this, not a big deal. In the past, the owner would just put money in. We're like, we just put crazy amount of money in. Like no, that's not how this works. So, but it obviously wasn't. That was what we kept digging to find out. No, that actually isn't true. Just what they were saying to make us feel better, I guess. But yeah, bottom line is we pulled back hard on AP, pushed out as many people as we could to that tune. We had a lot of overtime, so I was working. Uh, I I was driving late at night doing delivery, so all of our medications would go out via FedEx, and then if we missed the FedEx pickup at like 8 p.m. because we maybe we're overworked or have too much or we didn't have good process early in the day, um, we would have to drive it. But then I'm paying overtime, big time for people, and so I started driving almost every night, doing deliveries all over Texas and Oklahoma, hours at a time, coming back in the morning at 6 a.m. Like it was a complete grind. I was heavily focused on operations, not so much sales at the time, and my partner's focused on finances. So there's just a lot of different pieces and parts that are not pretty of that initial process. When it came to our cash collection, we dove in as fast as we could on RCM. If you guys have never been in healthcare, getting payers, specifically insurance payers, to pay you in a timely fashion is a complete pain in the butt. And there's a cyclical cash issue in the first quarter, and that's kind of what the person in the business was talking about. The first quarter is always tough with cash, but it wasn't as tough as we were at a whole nother level due to another issue. So yeah, that's really what I had to focus on, APAR, right?
Wow, that sounds pretty grueling because you've got the obviously the cash crunch happening in the business. You see $1 million in the bank account drop to 100K. That's frightening. And then beyond
our
that,
payroll was 250. That's the scariest part. Every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So you got that payroll coming every 2 weeks, and your cash collection is barely covering it, and you're like holding your breath, wondering if that payroll is going to come. Every person who's operated business completely resonates with that fear. To your second point, though, as you're trying to deal with the fires of the business, you made a point of mentioning that you're taking on an operational portion here because you're like, hey, if we don't meet these deadlines of getting to FedEx, now I'm the one driving all over state. And I just want to highlight that real fast, that as someone who bought a business that was doing, brought top line $20 million in revenue, cash flow, EBITDA of just over 3, you're very much operating in the business. And I just want to underline real fast that, for the listeners who are looking at buying a business that's $1, $2, or $3 million in top line and $100,000 to $300,000 of cash flow, to think that that's going to be passive is completely ludicrous.
No, it is. It's crazy to think that. And part of the reason is, even if I didn't have to do that, I would be doing that at times. And that's, Jed, you're a vet also. Part of leadership, especially in the military, is you learn the lowest person's qualification when you come to a new unit all the way up to the top. And you might have someone that's, training you that is the lowest paid person in front of you, right? Even though you are their boss, right? And so you go through that process every new unit you go to every 2 to 3 to 4 years. And so you just really take that mentality when you come to the business. So even if you didn't have to, you still have to. And that's the key takeaway. On top of that, if you don't do those things, you have very little respect from the team. And then on top of that, in my situation, I'm just trying to conserve cash as much as I can. I'm not putting in my mileage. I'm not, I'm just doing whatever I can to eat it personally as best I can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And right there, what you mentioned is one of the things that I've seen. It's why a lot of veterans are drawn to search, and why they tend to, and this is completely anecdotal, I don't have data for it, but it feels like they have disproportionate success because they very much know what it's like to show up at a new station where they basically have to relearn their job, and they do it every 3 years. And you're right, you have to start at the bottom, and otherwise you lose the respect of the guys on the front line. And yeah, that gets tough. So, all right, so you step into this fire, and how long did it take for you to plug the holes where you're like, okay, I can breathe?
We started seeing improvement in April, I think. So we bought in December. April, we're starting to see, okay, we broke even on EBITDA that month instead of lost money, which was a huge win, and cash was coming in. My business partner took us from a cash to accrual within 3 months. We plan to do that over a year. It's like, no, we got to do it now. So that was a huge project by her that she crushed. And then by the end of, I guess the start of Q4 of 22, so it'd be just about 9 months later, was when we hit an EBITDA back on par with what we thought we bought the business at, which was give or take 300K in a month. And I was like, holy crap, we're back. It took us, like, we're a year delayed, but we're right back where we thought we were. During this period, we immediately went on waivers with our bank. We're communicating with them. We're trying to do a basic restructuring. They're telling us we got to put money in. Our investors are like, no, we're not putting any money in, which, to their credit is the right move if the bank's willing to work with us, which they are. So we're going back and forth and negotiating. I thought by summer actually of 22 was the first time I thought the bank might take the business. So within 6 months, I'm in that place. I thought before that, especially when everyone's like, no one's touching it right now. We're just going to give you some waivers and hope this works out. But back, we hit a level of stability in Q4 of 22, and that was, I remember there were a few weeks in that where I'm like, okay, we're doing this. And rolling into Thanksgiving and Christmas, I was very thankful that year. Had a Christmas party, all excited, and that didn't last very long.
Yeah, I remember you telling me how you rolled into Christmas, had the holiday party, and things are feeling good, and then it all went right back to right back to terrible when January rolled up. But I have to imagine as you're running into Q4 of 2022, you're thinking, all right, that was a lot. That was stress. I've aged 5 years in 1 year. But this is what I signed on for. You're probably thinking that. You're like, hey, everyone told me this small business operation was really tough. Headwinds were going to come. We saw those headwinds head on, and now we're ready to, we achieved, we pulled through. Now we're ready to move forward.
Yeah, and the investor base was re-energized. Everyone's excited. The reports that we're pushing out are, we look like we're going to be able to service our debt. I think at that point, everyone had rallied to the point of being excited again about the business rather than waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? And that it was a very sweet moment in time.
Well, I'd love to dwell on that, but let's move on to January. So you have your Christmas party. 2023 comes in. What happens?
So we were more exposed than we thought in a product line. Because everyone overlaps in the service of our business, we have a lot of labor tied up in producing our medications. We had a clean room, we had all those pieces. Bottom line is we had 2 legs of a stool. We're missing a third leg. We were working on building that at the time. And one of the legs had a $2 million hit to our EBITDA, annually at least. And that product line, the reason why that happened was one of our, think of like an MSRP, it's called an AWP in healthcare, but an MSRP got changed by the manufacturer, which helps set the insurance reimbursement for us. And so what happened, they said, hey, a lot of our competitors have a much lower MSRP. We feel like we're not as competitive because of that. So we're going to drop ours by 90%. And so literally no announcement, overnight, get the alert, and our income from that goes away immediately. And we still have the same amount of patients, same amount of labor, and our just drug margin, not even gross margin that trickles down, but drug margin is 10% then at that point. So poof, $2 million off the books.
And that one line of business was what, 80% of your revenue?
Not our revenue. It was so profitable that it was only like a quarter of our revenue. But the other side of our business was like our loss leader, right? It was antibiotics focused.
Gotcha.
So it was near break even, had really good months, but it would swing wildly because you have no control over, what bug the person has that got them the antibiotics that they need. And on top of that, they're only on service for 3 months at a time, or sorry, 3 to 4 weeks at a time. And so with the other side, they're only 5 million of that, but it's, highly profitable, like $2 million out of the 5, right? That actually hit our EBITDA line. On top of that, though, they were highly predictive because they were 2 to 5 year patients. So the most predictable part of our business just went poof.
Wow. Yeah. So this MSRP drops their reimbursement amount 90%. And just like that, you see, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said your EBITDA at the time, you'd gotten right back to what, 3.5. And just like that in January, 2 of it disappears.
Yep.
but of course your costs don't disappear.
Right. Same amount of labor, all that, right? So over the next few months, we do a big layoff. Yeah, it was near half the entire team. We probably should have done more that first time. We reinvested in sales. We had built up some cash at that point. Thankfully, in Q4, we immediately went back to the bank and said, "Hey, we can't start making payments now. We need to do interest only." And they worked with us after some hand wringing. But and at this point, we're still not taking any more money from investors. So, and we're talking right now, 23. So this is January 23 when that hit. So a year and a half ago, I guess, or almost 2 years ago now. Wow. And to be completely transparent, like that was the beginning of the end. That was the straw. It wasn't even a straw. It was such a big, anvil that broke the camel's back, I guess. We just didn't know it yet. We just had hoped that we would be able to climb out of it. And so we doubled down on a new leg of the stool and focused on more specialty IVIG immunoglobulin product line. That line is highly predictive, but only 20% gross profit, or sorry, drug profit, excuse me. So it doesn't trickle down a ton, but at least it's recurring every month. Whereas the antibiotics is, a roller coaster of losing money or making money. So with that launch, we had a huge win, in relative statement, relatively at least in our business. We were built it from 0 to like 7 million annual recurring revenue over a year and a half, which by small business standards is a astounding growth with zero budget, on fumes the entire time and just continuing to push out our AP and accelerate AR as much as we can. So continue to work on efficiencies, built this awesome spreadsheet for pricing that helps people figure out their insurance payments and all of that, and automated all those pieces, was able to decrease our staff even more. Went through another RIF, and when we look at the top line of the business, we bought at 20 million. By the end of the first year, when we dipped and came back up, we were at 20 million, and by the end of the year 2023, we're at 20 million. So we had like all these struggles that we hit. We kept building back up through this process. And me as the sales go-to-market strategist, I'm like, yay! Except for our EBITDA was just disappearing, just completely going away. So yeah, there was. I never gave up on hope for the business, but until literally the last week when everything shut down, and that was in August of 24. So we went from January 23 to August 24 on fumes, building that other business line, trying to get value for it, seeing if we could even potentially sell the patients to recoup, looking at all different options, whether even a refinance somehow, even though our EBITDA was we'd fluctuate between 100K in EBITDA one month to negative 200. Like we would go back and forth. And so yeah, that's next question, Jed. I'm crying a little bit inside.
Yeah, no, I understand that. That's really difficult. You get to the point where you're basically you're rebuilding revenue, but you're not seeing it in the EBITDA side, and so cash flow is just leaking away.
Mm-hmm.
And you get into 2023, and like you said, that other leg of the stool gets knocked away, and so you double down and you build out a whole new revenue line that goes from 0 to 7 million with basically no investment. And so that says a lot about your go-to-market chops. Building something out of nothing. And like you said, small, especially on the small business side. I mean, we're looking at, SBA limits are 5 million if you want to buy, and you build out a revenue stream that was, bigger than that. And so you're doing everything you can to save the business, but it's just not turning into cash flow.
Yeah, and that's what it came down to in the end, right? When it comes down to decision making on what do we do next, we had finally dried up the cash. We'd move all our vendors to 90-day payments for these longer term payments, and we knew we were running out of payrolls. That's what it came down to, and so went to the bank, put together a deal, and got to the investors, put together a deal with them to inject some cash back into the business, because the new business line is interesting. But when we really crunched the math and kept going back over the pro forma again and again and again, the question kept coming up: how are we going to service the $12 million debt? And we had no. Our best guess was that it would take 3 years to start making payments again, and that means any cash we put in right now is at risk. And so, how do we? I literally was the one to say to my board, "Hey, we need to talk. I know we have this plan." Everyone actually had committed pretty much to the raise, and I called the board and said, "I don't think your money's safe if you put this in. I think it could get scooped within 6 months." And we decided on that call that we were going to be done.
A couple things to touch on there, especially right before we get to your discussion with the board. But you talked about, once this hit the EBITDA happened in January 2023, you said almost immediately within a month or two, you had a 50% layoff of your staff, and you're just cutting costs. And then beyond that, you're automating processes, you're putting systems in place, you're put that spreadsheet together for patients to understand their insurance reimbursement. You're doing everything you can to lean out the business. And this is on top of all the work you've done in the first year to try to recoup, the loss you had from, the lack of growth, as well as the lost business from the original salesperson. And so what I'm getting at is, one of the things the HBR guy talks about is, when you buy these enduring businesses, is what we hope to find, right? When you buy these enduring businesses, especially that first year, what you want to do in a perfect world is to do nothing, do no harm. Don't break the business.
Yeah.
But what you find, and with a lot of owners I talk to where it doesn't work out, and some that do, is that they find themselves stepping into a wildfire, and and since they've never been in the seat before, they think, okay, just do nothing, do nothing, don't break the business. But then you very quickly realize that, hey, it's your business, you're next on the line, no one's coming to save you. Am I really going to sit back and watch this fire burn down the business, or am I going to get to work and make some gutsy calls?
If I didn't do what I did, I would have been removed by the board, and understandably, right? Like, it's a miracle, frankly, that me and my partner never did. We were there for 2.5 years, and completely, survived the board deciding to hook us out, right? Which is wild, frankly. But thank you. I appreciate it if anybody sees this. I learned a lot, although it might have saved me a lot of pain. But no, there's, I obviously have, the goal was to not change anything, right? And as you run into issues, you'll see this on Search Funder, right? People go on Search Funder and post, how do people feel about turnarounds? And it's like, you don't want to go looking for a turnaround; it'll find you. There's no need to go hunting for that, because one, you want to avoid it if you can, but it's coming. So, anyways, it just cracks me up when I see that. But that's what I ended up in, right? I immediately went from thinking we were buying a solid business with solid financials, solid growth, a team that has already scaled it, right? Year over year, went 10 million, 15 million, 20 million over the last several years. Super exciting to see. Super great growth, and just bought it at a point in its cycle where it was done.
So here you are, you're in the seat. Tell me what's going through your head, like when you're facing these things, like in the face, especially January 23, and you're thinking, am I about to fire half my team? Like, you obviously, there's people in that business who have been there for a long time. They've all got their own opinions. Your investors and board have their own opinions. The bank definitely has its own opinion about that $14 million debt that's hanging around your neck. What's going through your head when you're thinking, man, am I really going to take a hatchet to this business? What am I going to do?
Well, I can't speak for 100% of the people that do search, but no one gets in the search to lay people off, right? Like, we're here to grow things and create value, and there's definitely people that need to be fired, but it's not half your staff, right, that needs to be laid off. That's so it's my brother's one of my best friends, and he's like, you've not been any fun to be around for the last 3 years, right? Like, just been a shell of my normal self at home, and it sucks. But frankly, all of those pressures are, they're just beyond anything you've done. I think it's really rose-colored glasses to look at search and say, this was me. Like, I'm not talking trash about anyone else, but I'm talking about my experience. When I was fundraising, I was like, man, this is the hardest thing I've ever done, which is the stupidest thing I've ever said in my life. And then I'm searching. I'm like, uh, I was like, this is really hard, even harder than raising money, because you're picking your destiny, and it's really scary, right? Because you don't want to pick wrong. That's why you see people search forever, right? You don't want to make the wrong choice. And, I'm not going to tell you that I made the right choice by any means, but it's scary. And then operating, and the type of things you walk into when you're operating, which there are great stories out there. I know a crew that acquired when we did, and they're just crushing it. Their stress levels crazy low. Like those are those stories out there, but they're also my story. And there's other like me, Jed. We've talked, and there's several other people we've connected with too that have stories like mine, where the information is imperfect.
Yeah, I think that's why it's even more important to highlight people like yourself and talk about like, hey, sometimes it doesn't work out. And sometimes, you can struggle for 3-4 years and you can put your whole heart and soul into it, and you can build multi-million dollars of revenue stream, and it still doesn't work out. And it's really important that people have if you're going into search, you have a clear-eyed view of like what you're getting yourself involved in. And so here we go. We're getting towards summer of 2023, summer of 2024. And you've built this extra revenue stream that, like you said, it's recurring, but the profits are pretty marginal. And
Yeah.
and I see this a lot in industries, especially service-based industries, where we all want the recurring revenue, but what we don't talk about is outside of SaaS, that recurring revenue, the profit margins are very slim. And your actual profit margin comes from the project work. And so a lot of people, they try to have the best of both worlds. Unfortunately, like you said, the antibiotics for your project work, and that's super unreliable. And so you're trying to build the recurring revenue. It's just not spitting off enough cash to keep the business running. And so you're working with the bank, you're working with investors, you're coming up with a plan to save the business, to really find a new way forward, especially since you just built out this 7 million of recurring revenue. You want to, make that happen. So like you said, you ultimately decided that it wasn't a good investment, but what was it? What was that conversation like, with the bank, with the investors, when you finally decided to pull the plug?
It was somber. I actually got several questions from investors during that, cycle of talking to everybody and getting ready to pass the hat. They're like, "Why are you still here?" That was actually the most common question I got. And I said, I just refuse to quit. Like, that's it. Like, I'm not going to walk away. Eventually you could say I did, but I only did it for the investors. I did not want to be done. But I think the risks were way too high for them. I had no plans. It's not like I found another job. I didn't find anything great. Oh, great. I'm going to go get paid to go do something else. And so for me, that was the only way. And I have two rules, which is don't go to jail and sleep at night. That's it. And so that's kind of what's guided me the last 3 years of really, doing my best, even if it's not enough. And that means not quitting. And I have been able to sleep pretty well the last few months, which has been great. But that's been the driving force of how I conducted myself during the operation phase of the business, especially when things are really rough. I had to make really hard decisions with employees and stuff. And there were definitely times where it was really hard to sleep, but I at least could rationalize sleeping. That was the big part, right? Where I didn't hate myself afterwards.
Right, where you're leaving it all on the field metaphorically.
Yeah.
And even in this case, like you said, you'd come up with a plan where the bank was on board and the investors were on board. They were willing to put another $2 million in the business to keep you going.
Right.
And which must have sounded like, a huge break for you after you've been just struggling for years trying to keep this thing moving. But then ultimately you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at the risk, and you come back and you tell the investors, hey guys, I know that you've already committed to put another 2 million, but I don't think it's the right investment. I think the risk is too high, and there's a good likelihood we're just going to set that on fire. And I would not be a good fiduciary to you if I took your money.
Right. And the decision came down to this. I got back into the model one last pass, and I did a little more sensitivity analysis, and I determined that it would take very little for this thing to fall apart. And I just I took one more pass, and I'm like, this right here, which is, gross profit. If we have a 1% drop in it, the model breaks. It does. And that's been happening to us slowly over time with anything in healthcare. So that's where it was like, I can't, like, to go through what I went the last 3 years, but then to get people to put more money in and then still do it to them anyways would break me potentially. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So August 24, you decide not to take the investors' money, and you close up shop at that point.
I'm out within 3 days.
Man, out within 3 days, and then I imagine the business closes its doors within a week.
Yep. Yeah. Same day that I walk, most everyone else gets walked. From the, we pretty much, we told the bank what was happening. They said, hey, give us a plan to control, protect our interests. So I wrote my own death plan. It was that and my business partner obviously did it together, but pretty much walk through who needs to stay behind to continue to collect and deal with assets, right? And so we still have a team operating today that's collecting on the AR. And so there's about 3 or 4 people still working there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean that just speaks to you and the team at the same time, because when the business goes under, it's very easy to just wipe your hands and walk away, especially when you don't have a personal guarantee. But then also realizing that once you realize that you're heading towards insolvency, you have a legal obligation as the CEO to make sure that your the members at the top of your debt stack, which in this case the bank, has the best opportunity to recoup whatever they can. And so that's important. I think that's another thing.
Well, in healthcare too, there's
like
patient abandonment as well. So like there's a huge responsibility for both the staff, the licensed people on the staff. There's a responsibility for the executives and the board to ensure that they're taken care of and making sure that there's continuity between their care. And so thankfully our staff did an amazing job of that. And so far so good. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's, again, important to touch on, because a lot of us, we always believe that we're going to be successful. So as a result, very few of us dive into what does bankruptcy look like, and because of that, very few of us, unless we've been through it, and God forbid you ever do, but you don't know what you're walking in through, and you don't know what your responsibilities are. And regardless of the state you're in, your first responsibility is make sure that if you've got unpaid payroll, that goes first. That's a legal obligation that will get you in a lot of trouble if you don't pay it. And then beyond that, once, and this is a gray area, but once you realize that you're moving towards insolvency, and that's a gray area legally, but once you get to that point, as the chief executive, that now the bank becomes a fiduciary. Now, anyone who has debt claim against that business, even if it's 2-3 levels down, now you're a fiduciary for their claims as well. And so every decision is a balancing act between, is this the best move to keep the business afloat, or is this the best move to protect the interests of my debt holders? We like to talk about the FedEx story about how he took his last $5,000 and went to Vegas and gambled it to try to keep the business alive. Probably illegal if that hadn't worked. But yeah, these are things that are just really important, especially when you have a business of the scale that you're working with.
Yeah, no, it's true, and I remember skipping over all those classes and not listening to bankruptcy in class. It's like, it's not my problem. Yeah. I learned.
So now that you're out of business, it's been a few months now. You've had some time to, slink away into the cave and rest a little bit. Now you're emerging, but at least you're sleeping better at night, so that's good. What are some of the big takeaways? Because obviously you're on this call, you're talking to people who are interested in search, or they've been operators, or they're just wondering, what's it really like once you're the guy or gal in the seat making the decisions? And looking back at it, you've had some successes, you've had some failures. What are some of the big takeaways you have for people who are interested in going down this model, regardless of whether it's traditional or self-funded? What's it like being in the seat, and what would you like them to know about?
I think one of the big questions I generally get, would I do it again? right? Whether metaphorically, right, to do it all over again, or to try again in the future and do search, right? I don't know. I think that's a fair answer. I think what I've learned is invaluable without a doubt. Like I'm much more sharp in a lot of different areas and ways than I ever thought I'd be at this point in my life. Um, I yeah, I think there's definitely a path in which I end up back in a CEO seat in a similar fashion. Um, but takeaways wise for y'all listening, I would say that you know figure out how many layers you need to go in your bean dip. Like there's always more, but good luck with that. But it's actually rare, and this is something that I learned along the way, especially a lot of my investors that were prior searchers. They're like, oh, I remember my first year, I thought I was going to lose the business too. That was like actually a common thing that investors told me, and I'm like, you're kidding. Like no one talks about that. I had about 20 different investors, and half of them were prior searchers. And so, that theme was really eye-opening. And so expect to feel like you're going to lose your business in the first year. And the first year actually didn't kill us, right? The first year was painful and scary. And if we didn't make the right moves, we might have had a huge issue and I might have been removed or something like that. That would probably have been the worst outcome in the first year. But it was an industry headwind that just crushed us in the long run. So, yeah, I think that's the big thing. I think it's totally fair for me to bring this up. I had very minimal healthcare experience, and I am a go-to-market guy. So stepping into an industry specifically alone from just healthcare, but where I don't have control over price, is crushing to me. So just like I wanted to not be in VC due to product market fit, I don't want to be in industries anymore where I have no control over the P. Right? I control. I do rate quantity, but if I can't control price, it's an uphill battle. So I think whatever I do, I'll stay out of that scenario. I definitely, I have a client right now. I'm doing some consulting with healthcare, so I have no problem with that. I'm not going to hang my complete hat in that arena again.
I think that's a really good insight, especially for getting an idea of what are the things that the problems I'm willing to solve and the ones I'm interested in solving and the ones that I don't want to be a part of whatsoever. Because the guys and gals who are leading Nova Nordis are doing just fine, but at the same time, you're choosing what kind of hard you want to deal with. And that's a question that I get a lot from potential searchers where they say, hey, what's the best industry to go into? What's the most economically resilient industry to go into? And the thing I always tell them is like every industry is hard. You just have to pick what kind of hard you want to deal with.
Right.
SaaS is hard. It's very hard.
Right. I think there's something that I just remembered. I think it's something I want to interrupt really quick, but me and my business partner within 6 months had a joke, should have bought a landscaping company. That was our joke. And we kept it for 3 years of operating. It's like, man, should have bought a boring business. Anyways.
Well, for those of you who don't know, I had a landscaping company and it also
there you go.
So they can fail. Absolutely can fail. But yeah, you're right. It talks about like, what's your hard? What do you want to deal with? And one of the things, that I think makes your experience so valuable and why I do think you'll end up back in the CEO position is because until you've been in that seat, you just don't understand. You've never seen it. You don't know how to react in the operations, and you don't have a track record to say, how's this going to turn out and how am I going to react? And we talk about it in the military all the time. People join, they're like, "Hoorah, can't wait to deploy." And you have no idea what's going to happen until that bullet whizzes by your camp. And you're like, are you going to duck? Are you going to charge? What are you going to do? And you have no idea. And so you've got those scars from being in the seat and making those tough decisions. Now you're like, hey, here's some lessons learned. Here's some things that I would do and things I wouldn't do. But you at least know what it's like to sit there and have to make those decisions.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's, that's the hard won lessons that I was mentioning earlier, where the stuff I've learned is invaluable. The things that I've had to decide and rationalize. I think on a personal note, for me, I think the biggest win is I'm still married and my kids love me. So like slam dunk. But but yeah, aside from that, like the business life was tough the last several years. So yeah,
In retrospect, it looks like your wife's concerns were very palpable and very realistic.
Yeah, not helpful. Now it limits my options going forward. She gets a win in her camp.
Yeah. Good luck. I'm in the same camp. Living that down is a tough one.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, one other thing I want to touch on that you brought up is the fact that you said half of your investors who had felt like they were going to lose their business in the first year. And one of the things I really like about having these conversations is the fact that we just don't talk about it. We don't talk about the struggles. We don't talk about the failures. And usually when we do, we wait until we've got a string of 10 really awesome successes to say, oh, look at all the struggle that I went through to get to my success. We don't talk about the fact that, oh, my business went under and now I'm at home and I'm unemployed. We don't talk at that point. So
what does it
really
look like now?
You're actually bringing that out. Yeah.
So I haven't had a raise or a bonus in the 3 years of operating as a CEO because there was no cash, right? And I had a daughter in college, so she is debt-free college, which is great, but that means my cash was not existent. So I have 401k, but I didn't want to touch it, obviously. So I immediately, had to start looking for something. One of my investors and board members actually connected me with a portfolio company that I could do some consulting with. I actually got an email this morning from another investor that said, "Hey, was thinking of you. I was hoping that you might be able to talk to a searcher who might need some help with sales process and operations." Within 2 weeks, though, bottom line of losing the business and me stepping out, I had 4 signed contracts with consulting, just doing personal consulting with them for either operations or sales or CEO, just fractional work where they're either process or growth minded. First time going outbound, it's been a founder-led sales process and the founder's now stepped out. So what do we do? Stuff like that, things that are all in my wheelhouse. But by the end of that 2 weeks, I was making more doing that than I was as a CEO, which was not the plan. I had no plan, right? I was completely just a mess coming out of it, but I got to stay married, so I got to keep a roof over their head, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you've got at least a short-term silver lining there. Adding some cash definitely helps smooth that out just a little bit.
Yeah.
So, one final thing I'll touch on is the fact that how you end things is just as important as how you start them. And very end, the fact that you were honest to your investors, the fact that you told them, hey, we're probably going to light your money on fire. This is not a good investment. They decide to close the business. It helps make sure that you maintain those relationships with your investors who then are able to, be a resource in the future. Like you weren't expecting them to refer you to other, CEOs or management teams that you could then consult for. But it is true that for the vast majority of us, failure is not the problem. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to end your career as long as you do it the right way. As long as you're being honest about it, like you said, sleep at night, don't go to jail. But if you put in the work, you're putting in a lot of the effort, failure ends up just being a big lesson and it sucks. But, as long as you go out the right way, it does open up doors in the future.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And, I think a couple months removed, I'm a lot more stable than I was month one. A lot more, I think it's really easy for it to feel like it defines you immediately. That's probably the palatable feeling, an overwhelming feeling is like, this is who I am. That's tough. But, did a lot of therapy, AKA smoking meat and woodwork and different projects just to get my body moving and reconnecting with things I enjoy that I stopped doing. Started playing guitar again. I haven't done that in 4 or 5 years. So just trying to connect with things outside of what I've defined myself as for a while. And it's been really healthy and helpful. And because if you haven't guys figured this out, going through this is heartbreaking. It is completely heartbreaking. I moved my family across country to do this, and new schools, new friends, everything. And when it doesn't work out, it is rough.
Yeah, I think it's clear just from listening to your conversation, and then I mean, I know I can hear in your voice. I mean, you pour your heart and soul into something and it doesn't work out. It's really really difficult. And again, can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and telling your story, giving us your lessons learned. We've got about a dozen people here who have stuck out for the whole story, and I think that speaks a lot to the amount of value that you're given. And I'd like to open it up for maybe a few questions here if anybody has a question they have for Joe. And yeah, I think we've got maybe 20 minutes or so if you guys have a few questions. You can either unmute and say it out loud since there's not a huge group of us, or you just throw it in the chat and I'll read it for you.
Hi, Joe. I have a question. So two things kind of stood out to me at the start when you were evaluating the deal. One was, I think that you mentioned you paid 6x EBITDA, which is on the higher side, I think, of what we typically hear. So it was kind of curious, like why you and your CFO felt you were comfortable with that. And then the second piece was just, obviously this $12 million note just hung over your guys' head like throughout throughout the lifetime of the business. And so just curious, like, was the debt to income ratio kind of normal or low, but it caught up to you guys, or would you, any lessons learned around that and thinking about that?
Yeah. First with the debt piece, I posted, I think on Monday, my view of LBO and, how that hung over us. So check that out on my LinkedIn, because it's a, but the short version of it is, yeah, it's a huge problem. And, the amount of debt we took was strategic for returns. It didn't account for not doing well, right? Like where it's like, hey, what's our maximum debt to EBITDA ratio we can get? Sweet. That's what we want. That's who our loan provider is going to be. And they were a fine partner. There was no issues from that perspective. But from a strategy standpoint, it maximized the opportunity for returns and also maximized their opportunity for default. So it's a double-edged sword. So going back to your first question, which was about multiple. So one thing that isn't talked about much in search, except for when they're talking about 2 to 3x or 3 to 5x on deals, or 3 to 4, whatever multiple we're talking about. If you're looking at smaller deals, you can get away with that amount sometimes. And then there's industry specific, right? And so with the industry we were looking at, that was mid-range to low. Even with the business where we got it to, if we could get the same EBITDA, by the time we had built out the new product lines, the multiple had risen to like 9x. So if we just get back to our original EBITDA we bought at, we had an 8 to 9x multiple. So really, it's relative, I guess would be my answer. When it comes to multiples, especially when you're buying a bigger business with 3 to 4 million in EBITDA.
Gotcha.
And
Thank you.
if you remember correctly, what was the DSCR when you acquired?
I don't know. Pull it up.
That's fair. We'll do some math.
Yeah, do it. I've flushed that. Too many numbers between now and then.
Great question, Katie.
Hey, y'all, I've got a question. Joe, thank you so much for sharing your story. I can empathize and know how tough this all is. I have this like little strand of hair that won't go down. It's actually from a bald spot that I got managing my company. It hasn't fully grown out. I'm still trying to like flatten it down. I'm curious. So the salesperson left in due diligence and the seller didn't disclose that to you. Did that cause, am I assuming that they didn't disclose?
I'm not going to talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure there's some sensitivity around it.
Yeah.
My other question.
Good question, though. I want to say good question.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because I had a lot of issues with my seller and legal and like the toxicity it created in the culture, and the entire company kind of got pulled into all of the legal stuff and pointing fingers. And it was really hard to kind of like grab that bull by the horns as a newbie to the company, right? I knew turnarounds like theoretically, discovered mine and learned more along the way. As you were like forced into layoffs, how did you maintain culture? Like, what did that feel like talking to the team? How did you kind
Oh,
of
yeah.
address their fears, concerns?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So there was a point in time where, the original owner, stepped back, from the business. And on top of that, within a few months, we were doing layoffs. And so, I would say uh, we had walkouts throughout that period of time because we're turning up the heat on certain things. Our head of RCM, we're trying to accelerate revenue cycle collection, and they just walk out, right? And because they're feeling the pressure too much. And yeah, it's really tough. I would not say we had an amazing culture through the whole process. I would say it was impressive how good it was for how tough things were. And that's kind of like the best hope you can have when really bad things continue to happen. I would say majority, like this is like I don't know if I should be happy about this or not, but like everyone was pretty consistently surprised when something bad was happening. But that doesn't feel good as the owner, right? Um, make a survivor reference, but a blind side is effective. That's why you use it. But it is extremely painful for everyone, including yourself. But if people in a big group, I think at an individual basis are pretty trustworthy. I think in aggregate are very dangerous. And so how to message, when to message, to take those steps is just really hard. Happy to talk offline though, and get specific about what you're dealing with.
Yeah, where are you located? Should we like grab some drinks and commiserate?
Dallas, Texas.
No way. I left Dallas to acquire my company in Austin. I've since exited, but it's a stone's throw. One of these days I'll reach out to you. Can I ask one more question?
Go for it.
How did you view partnered versus non-partnered search? The reason I asked that question is because I felt my operations were really lonely. It was just me. I didn't feel like there was anybody to really balance out the leadership team. It was really hard to get people to see me as a human. They saw me more of like as an enemy or forcibly orchestrating the turnaround, right?
Yes.
And so I'm curious, like, how you viewed a partnered operation, and whether if you do this again or not, would you consider partnering with someone again?
Whether I do search or something else, I always prefer partners. It's probably the VC background that I have, right? Where it's very normal to have co-founders, right? That doesn't mean that. So, like, if I do search, I would have, whether I'd have a partner or have someone I'm bringing in, I know from day one that's going to be on my side. Because one of the things that takes a long time to figure out when you walk in is how is everyone going to interact and work together? Because the new dynamic just takes a long time to shake out. I would say it took us a year for things to really shake out and the reporting structure to flow correctly for people to feel like they knew each other enough, like me and my direct reports knew each other enough to have hard conversations. It wasn't perfect though. However, some of the people that I hired and brought in from day one, it was easy with them. And so that is a huge takeaway, I think, for anyone is, that if the person isn't going to be able to come around to the new ownership structure, reporting structure, you might need to make that move. And the ones that did stick around, thankfully, we got to a good working status. Might not have been perfectly smooth, but it was wildly effective, and we worked together. Yeah, so that I think that's a huge piece. And part of that just the partnership piece for me is like I know if I'm fully in charge of books, I either need to bring someone in for the finance function that can own it, whether consulting group or whatever else, or not. It's not my strength. You don't want me doing it. I shouldn't be reporting to a bank. Dangerous. And I'm so glad I was right about that because it would have been a mess had I walked into this without somebody like that.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think it touches back on the theme from earlier that when we're thrown into chaos unexpectedly, we often as searchers default to not making any changes. And in these situations, changes are necessary. And it's contrary to all of the advice that exists out there because nobody talks about it, right? And so the more and more we talk about how change is necessary when circumstances require it, I hope that more and more people will hear it and realize that it's okay to make change.
Yeah, and the thing you said earlier too, Kenzo, was that it's super lonely. So one of my clients actually right now is a searcher who is a solo searcher, and they acquired maybe 6, 8 months ago, and I'm helping with outbound sales. But what I'm also doing is I'm a really good confidant, right? Like I'm actually able to take time out of some other stuff I'm doing just to talk about the insanity and stress of doing this, right? It's hard and figuring out those reporting lines and relationships and all those pieces. And I think not having a partner in search definitely leaves a gap in need because it's not, even if you're have a board of directors, can't really go to your board of directors for stuff like that. There is a certain level of separation that you need. So even with a partnered search though, I actually had a business coach for the first 8, 9 months of search because I needed someone else not to dump on other than my business partner, right? Because it's so easy just to dump on them of like everything you're feeling, but they're also dealing with the same stuff. And so like, you don't want to be piling on them and making it even worse. So it's definitely a huge tip I'd give is to take one. I can recommend Kirk Wayman of Icon Coaching.
I appreciate that. Thanks. Yeah, my husband was my impromptu buddy in the transaction unwillingly, right? And I'm so glad we're still married. We learned so much about our relationship through this whole process.
Anyone else have any questions? You go ahead, Jed.
So, 2 things to add real fast. One is that you're absolutely right. Every searcher I talk to that does end up acquiring, they always talk about how lonely it is being the guy or gal in charge. And one of the big takeaways, especially from people who are coming from MBA programs or coming from a white collar corporate environment, is that if you are buying into a service industry, HVAC, plumbing, landscaping, something like that, 95%, if not more, of your employee base are going to be blue collar guys and gals. And what you don't realize is, half of them may not even have an email address, much less know how to use a computer very well. So it is a very big culture shock. So it's not just that you can't have a conversation about EBITDA or cash flow. It's hard to have a conversation about anything that is go to market or corporate, and it becomes very lonely because you get stuck in your head and you don't have anybody to dump on, so to speak. So that is a big part of it. The other thing though, and this is completely ad hoc, but I'm going to throw this in the chat. This is a link on Amazon to a book called Corporate Turnarounds by Jeff Sands. He's kind of the guy on how to do corporate turnarounds. And what I find is that, we all know we've got the HBR guide, we have the buy then build books. These are great. And there's a million business books out there. But if you're wondering what it's like, to step into a business that's on fire and what you do, in a step-by-step procedural way, this is it. Cash conversion cycle, focusing on the things that matter. And hearing your story, experiencing it myself, I can tell you from experience, I read this book as therapy. I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, this is it. So it is an affiliated link. So if you want to not give me 50 cents for that, that's fine. Go find it on Amazon yourself. I don't care. But highly, highly recommend this book if you plan on operating a business in the near future. Because like you said, Joe, your turnaround will come. Your business will absolutely hit that turnaround headwind. And so there's no sense in going to look for it. It will find you. We've got enough time for probably one more question here, and then we'll wrap it up. All right. Well, then really want to thank everybody for being here. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time, and everybody on a Thursday morning, more or less. Like, do you guys even have jobs? What's going on here? So thanks for being here. Love hearing your story, Joe. Love hearing the real world analysis of what it's like to be in the seat, what it's like to stare, destruction and abyss in the face. And really love what you're doing, talking to people about the real life scenario of what happens and giving them a clear-eyed view of the challenges of being an operator. And I have no doubt that the experiences that you've accumulated over the last several years are going to make you a killer operator when you walk into a business and their biggest struggle is, oh my God, our Facebook ads turned off, and you're like, don't worry, guys, I got this. So I have a lot of faith that you're going to be successful in the future.
Yeah, no, the level of what a problem is definitely different than when I started. I think that's kind of, someone asked me recently that a similar takeaway of like what the last 10 years in general, because I was, 10 years ago, I was doing search and rescue and law enforcement in the Coast Guard. And, when I got into business, eventually you kind of cool off and like, did all my commissions pay out was the biggest problem I dealt with in the first few years of being in business when I was a sales guy. And then, when I stepped into the business, cash flow issues, you're like, this thing is the biggest, ugliest monster you've ever seen. And then you're dealing with, negotiating with the bank, and you're dealing with investors who are like, what is going on? And, just progressively realizing I'm more and more equipped than I thought I was to handle this level of problem and stress. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway for me that I got the most out of, which is, kind of what you touched on. What is really a problem? And so, whether that's now family pointed or whatever else in my relationships and business, the level of what I consider a problem is way different than it used to be. And I think that allows me to have a lot more peace and calm and not let my blood pressure take off on me, and think clearly, and it's just a muscle. And so I'm of the personal belief, our goal, especially if you're on this call or listening to it in the future, personal belief that our goal in life is to take on more and more responsibility and more stress, and normalize that stress into something that isn't stress anymore. And if you can do that, that's what, high achievers come from, is being able to manage that and get to that point. So yeah, really appreciate everyone listening to my story, and my own therapy version of this, I guess, is talking it out, continuing to, not run away from it. And hope it was super helpful.
Well, nothing more to add to that. Thanks, Joe. Thanks everybody for being on the call, and we'll try to do a few more of these over the next few weeks. Thanks again. Bye.